Good afternoon, evening, everybody. We've come to the final session of the Global Digital Asset Regulatory Summit. My name is Amy Rose and I'm the Managing Director at the Digital Economy Council of Australia. We have gone all over the world today. We spent a lot of time discussing Australia, but we've gone across the APAC region, the EU, Europe, New Zealand, and look, it's been a massive day. We're going to close today with a conversation from Africa. And look, I'll be honest, I have a lot of Google searches saved. It's a bit random, but essentially I have digital economy, blockchain, and various jurisdictions so that I can follow what's happening internationally. And I get dozens of Google responses and emails every day about what is happening in Africa and particularly Nigeria. So it is an absolute pleasure to have Emmanuel on the stage today. He is joined by moderator, host Andrea Frosinini, and I'm going to bring them to the stage. It is Emmanuel, you call him Babs. He is a thought leader who's been leading or paving the way for digital assets in Nigeria for almost a decade. And he used to be with Binance, and he's founded a few companies and exited a few companies. So over there, he's quite a phenomenal player. So without further ado, I'm going to bring them both to the stage. Here we go. 5 seconds is the countdown that it takes. Here we go. Thank you, gentlemen. You have the stage.
Hi, Rose. Great to be here.
Yeah, great to be here as well.
Hi, Emmanuel. Welcome.
Hey.
All right, I'm just going to hand the session over to you guys. So it's all yours.
All right.
Hello. Nice. Great to be here. So, Emmanuel, thanks for being with us today. We'll go straight to the point. I'll listen too much time because I'm eager to listen from you. So, we're here to discuss digital assets with a focus on Nigeria, which is a giant in West Africa. And I'm a keen supporter of the African continent. So my first question is, how would you describe Nigeria's current regulatory framework as to digital assets? And besides this, key changes have been implemented in recent years in the country. I'm eager to start from this. Stage is yours.
Yeah, it's I think it's quite interesting, the topic of how like the digital asset scene has obviously evolved in Nigeria over the years, right? And I think the way to describe the regulatory framework in the country of Nigeria is just been generally evolving, right? So it's kind of like quite unstable, at least over the past 6 years. So let me give context, right? So I think sometime in 2018, we had the first warning from the central bank on digital assets. I think this is common practice across several regulators globally. And then that was fine, and the industry was obviously, progressing. The banks were, taking due diligence very seriously, and everybody was operating, bearing in mind the warning from the central bank. However, sometime in 2021, there was a ban on crypto transactions. This was in February, and there was a huge clampdown on blocking of bank accounts, and that whole thing happened. And that was where P2P trading took off in Nigeria. And sometime in the same year, we launched the e-Naira. So the e-Naira was launched, and that obviously was quite a positive move, considering in that same year they had obviously banned cryptocurrency. So I think the strategy for the government then was primarily to just indicate that there's willingness to engage on digital assets, and they wanted to obviously try a regulated, cryptocurrency, CBDC as it were, right? The next year we had the SEC release the rules, on digital assets, basically defining what cryptocurrencies were in Nigeria. And it was given the status of securities, right? There was a whole 54-page document that was released back then. But obviously that couldn't be enforced because there was a ban by another regulator. I think in 2023, after a bunch of engagements, by the way, I sit on the advisory board of the Nigeria's Blockchain Association, where we founded in 2017, 2018. So there's been a lot of engagement. And then finally last year, we had a U-turn on that decision. So the ban on BAT was lifted, right? And that signaled that okay, the digital asset framework by the SEC can now be enforced. In fact, there's an entire other document around the national blockchain strategy, which can now come into play as well. However, in 2024, we had a huge depreciation of the naira, where prices moved by more than 30%. And obviously, the government, blamed the cryptocurrency trading activities for affecting the naira. I'm sure a lot of people might have heard of the Binance versus Nigeria issue.
That was an issue, a big one.
Yes. So there was now a huge clampdown again on cryptocurrencies, even though there was no ban, right? So
it's like
bank accounts,
roller coaster, up and down.
yeah, so it's been very tough. However, there was a new SEC DG that was appointed, the Director General of the SEC, who is a very pro-crypto individual and a very close supporter of the industry. And obviously he has been able to engage, and I think the central bank has also supported his approach. And today, there's a licensing framework in place. And just yesterday, 7 people were given licenses to operate. We have 2 licensed exchanges and some other people that made it into a sandbox, right? 5 other people. So right now, I would say there is clarity as to like how to operate a digital assets company, or how to regulate the entire industry. So there is clarity now, and that regulator is the SEC, and things are a lot more calm.
Awesome. Emmanuel, you mentioned a few things on the main radar as well. One thing is the Central Bank of Nigeria, the so-called CBN, and the Naira, by the way. Talking about the central bank, what role actually does it play in shaping policies around these assets? And how has its stance evolved since the launch of the Naira CBDC, local CBDC?
I think that's quite interesting. First of all, the Central Bank of Nigeria is one of the most powerful regulators in the country, right? And obviously, by the very nature of digital assets, it exists both as a security and also as a payments, instrument, right? Where we have stable coins and a bunch of that. So the central bank has always been very interested in the industry, like way back 2017. And Africa, and even in Africa today, like we have Nigeria being the first country to launch its own digital like assets, which is the e-Naira. So considering how forward-thinking they've always been, right? They've been very involved. However, the decisions were made, whether good or not, to the industry, it has always been obviously for the the best, in the best interest of the economy. So the decision to lift the ban in 2023 just last December, like signaled finally to the industry that the central bank was listening, right? The issues in 2024 this year, I think are primarily because there was no regulation for the industry. And that's what happens when, you operate in Nigeria without a license. Gets, drawn into things that probably are not, related to you. And that's why to actually, start licensing companies even also came from the central bank, because the central bank was also saying, let's get the people that are, legit licensed, and let's know who we are, chasing and who we are not chasing, that kind of thing. So that's kind of like been the scene. So the central bank's approach has always been, very hands-on. And now I think they are, very soft, SEC, in terms of like the regulations now.
Now you were mentioning the SEC, by the way, and that comes to my next question, Emmanuel. Can you please provide some insights into the Securities and Exchange Commission of Nigeria's guideline on digital assets, and in particular in relation to investor protection and market stability? That's what the main focus, I guess, is. I mean, investor protection and market stability are two pillars for the future.
Yeah, obviously, the Securities and Exchange Commission is responsible for regulating like the capital markets, right? And obviously, in doing that, they try to ensure investor protection and market stability. In, I think, 2020, they released a statement recognizing digital assets, which I mentioned earlier as well. And that guideline that was released has played a key role in obviously guiding their approach towards things like ICO, STOs, IEOs, and even general trading of digital assets, right? So I think the main thing they've always tried to do, which I believe is also same for a bunch of other regulators, is try to balance the need for innovation and the need to also protect, investors, right? And that's kind of like been key thing for them. And that's why obviously they've imposed a bunch of rules, including AML, CFTs, and KYC policies for a bunch
That
of the.
security.
And unfortunately, all these platforms were already doing some of these things locally, right? So and that's why for me, I've always been a firm believer on innovation that is obviously that is compliant innovation, basically. That even though innovation always goes ahead of regulation, um, as you innovate and bearing in mind the current practices and who your, most likely regulator will be, it's easier to align. And that's why even today that we have crypto licenses in Nigeria, one of the reasons why we were able to also achieve this is because we had an ecosystem that already enforced KYC policies, AML policies. We were
Very
from
interesting.
exchange reporting to we're already doing financial transactions reporting STRs to
Which
the
is a real
regulator.
innovation, by the way, in the crypto space and digital
Yeah.
asset space, having this KYC stuff. You mentioned, Manuel, innovation, which is some kind of magic word to me. How's Nigeria balancing the need for innovation in the blockchain space with what I would define imperative of consumer protection and prevention of financial crimes, which is the thing we all read the news recently in recent years. So how is the country balancing this attitude, these demands?
Yeah, so I think they've tried different things. Obviously, the central bank in era was an initiative that exemplified how, they wanted to do a controlled approach, right? Leveraging blockchain technology, of course, with regulatory oversight. However, obviously, the INERA hasn't been, a huge success. And because of that, now obviously release that obviously, as I said earlier, enforces KYC AML practices but more so just ensuring that, because we used to have a lot of scams, right, in Africa, where there's this Ponzi scheme. That's, and in fact,
I
the
would say
word block,
everywhere, not only Africa.
yeah,
That's a little bit problem.
the word crypto back then used to just be associated with scam everywhere, right?
Yeah.
So trying to change that narrative has always been something that like we've really tried to do, and I think that's what the regulators are also interested in, where both the players and the regulators have like a common interest in terms of how do we protect people, how do we get people into the industry, and how do you get them to actually, how do we get the industry to also thrive in a safe way?
Nice. I mean, we all know that scams are indeed a huge problem. It's a global one. Think of what has been happening in recent years behind the ocean, on the other side of the ocean. So it's a global trouble. It's a global challenge, I would say. Coming to challenges, Emmanuel. In your opinion, what are the major ones, and what are the barriers that these vast companies face when navigating Nigeria's regulatory environment? I mean, specifically as to Nigeria.
Yeah. I think in the past, right, as I said again, in the past, because now we have a crypto license now. So, but however, in the past, I think there's never been a unified regulatory framework, right? As I said earlier, the central bank would say one thing, the SEC would say another thing. And, there was just a lot of instability, even aside from just the regulators saying different things, there was also an instability in the in the actual regulation, right? This year there was a whole huge clampdown because of the FX thing I mentioned. Last year there was a U-turn where the ban was lifted. So it's quite challenging, right? And obviously I know that even as an investor myself, like it's very difficult to actually run a business in a market where like government regulation is not consistent, right? Which is
It's
obviously
also the
what's
political instability that might affect when change
yeah.
government, when change
So last
political
year there was
direction is not a fact.
exactly. So by the way, so last year there was a change of governments, right? Which I
Yeah,
think is strong towards the positive approach to crypto. So the same last year, central bank governor was changed, and then the new central bank governor, lifted the ban, right? So and then this year, obviously, I think there was like, okay, was that decision the right decision? And then, at the end of the day, everybody's fine now, and it's the right decision, and let's go on. So yeah, it's very challenging to build any business in that kind of environment. But right now, I think we've had a final rest in place, right, as it were, at least for now, for the industry. So there's a lot more stability, and I think Nigeria is open for business.
what about the regulations, Manuel? How are Nigerian banks engaging with international bodies? Now, we know that crypto, by the way, is going global. So locally, Nigerian regulators, how are they engaging with international bodies and with other countries as well to harmonize these vast regulations to promote cross-border cooperation? I mean, you know that I deal with cross-border trade, so I'm really eager to understand how this fits into a much global picture.
Yeah, makes sense. So I think that's a very good question, actually. But unfortunately, since I'm not a regulator, I don't know fully what they do. However, industry now in Nigeria, from starting the blockchain association to, building some of the biggest platforms here, I've come to realize that like the regulators are actually very collaborative, right? Even though the end, from time to time things change, but the fact that things change, both back and forth, indicates that they are listening and they're trying to, course correct, right? So in terms of how they engage with international bodies, I know there have been a bunch of times where both the central bank and the SEC have asked us for, global standards of like, how is this regulated in, for instance, Singapore and the US. And so we've given them a lot of case studies. We have, had occasion to do presentations in the floor of the Senate. And, so they're very curious to know how things work. And in fact, last I heard, there were if a few of the regulators sends people to some of these countries to engage regulators there, right? So they are very keen on learning, right, in terms of how to figure this out, because it's still very early days in Nigeria, right, when it comes to like regulating industry, and some of our regulatory. Yeah, go on.
Yeah. In your view, how is Nigeria, how is the country's regulatory approach impacted the growth of digital asset sector within the country? I mean, particularly for startups and foreign investments. I know that the country as a whole is one of the main targets in the area for its own, uh, I would say characteristics. Remember that you have more than 200 million people living down there, so it's a huge market. We'd love to have your point of view to this.
Yeah, Nigeria's regulatory approach has had a mixed impact on the growth of like the digital asset sector, right? Obviously from the cautious stand to the recent clampdown to, these things slowed down the growth of the industry. I think we would have been, in a much better place now if we got here faster, right?
Mhm.
So industry's growth has been slowed down, and now just opening up. Obviously things like the e-Naira, the SEC guidelines, and right now they have an accelerated regulatory incubation program, uh, which has released 7 crypto licenses already. So that is now kind of like the light at the end of the tunnel that's we're seeing in Nigeria. So in as much as the industry's growth slowed down for a bit over the past 4 5 years, I think that we are getting it right now, right? So we can just only wait to see the next 2 years to just at least confirm that things are actually allowed to play out, and then we can kind of like now make a better judgment on this.
Yes. Well, to understand now, what steps have been taken to ensure that the country's regulatory framework remains adaptable to a rapidly changing digital asset landscape, especially what concerns managing technology, like DeFi, NFTs, and much more related to the blockchain space.
I think the SEC's ongoing consultations with industry stakeholders, we've had like a bunch of calls with the Director General and international bodies. It reflects the recognition of the importance of flexibility and responsiveness in regulation of digital assets, right? Taking these consultations is, I think, a big win. And that is really the only way we can expect them to at least for now get a hang of this, right? Because in as much as the industry is rapidly changing and things are moving faster than I don't think regulation can ever catch up with the innovation globally, right? And worst of all for crypto, where things move twice as fast. So it's very important that
Wow,
those
even more
conversations,
than that.
yeah, with the regulators, right? There has to be ongoing conversations with the regulators. And the regulators also have to be increasingly aware of the need to actually keep the pace, right? They need to keep pace with the changes, things like NFTs, DeFi. Now they are probably old school things. There's probably like newer things. There's now different kind of blockchains, layer 2, this, and they're like, what's going on? So it's important that they get the upskilled, right? I think that would be good as well. I know they do a lot of training, so that should be fine. But yeah, so those are the two main things, training keeping up with the innovation just in general, and then like engaging with stakeholders. I think those are key things that they should be taken.
Yeah. If we have to frame Nigeria into a much larger picture, what's going on in the USA, China, and Singapore, how is the country regulatory landscape, digital assets be compared to those of the leaders, of the leading countries in space? How would you frame local regulatory landscape? Instead, it's a global affair, so we want to understand how local impact what's going on in the global.
So I think if I were to compare Nigeria's regulatory landscape to that of the US or China or Singapore, like obviously it's different, like across board. Like, there are even a bunch of challenges right now, like crypto in the US as well, and China, right? I think Singapore has been the most stable, you know.
Yes,
Um,
not only for
and
crypto, it's a whole digital economy. It's main standard, yes.
so for Nigeria, I would just say it's still like developing, to be honest. Even with these licenses that came out yesterday, these are approval in principle licenses. Like, it's like, okay, let's try this, you know. So it's still developing, unlike the more established frameworks, like Singapore. However, I think our focus on balancing innovation and customer protection, considering our context where, there were indeed a lot of like fraudulent platforms here and there. And also obviously our financial stability of like the FX rate and everything, so it's also aligns with the approaches of a lot of these countries, right? So that's kind of like it's still early days for Nigeria, but I believe we're on the right track.
Nice. Final questions, Emmanuel. Looking ahead, what are the next key regulatory milestones or reforms that you anticipate Nigeria's digital asset system, and how do you see this shaping the future of the industry?
Firstly, I think obviously, as we all know, Nigeria is the biggest market in Africa. It is the biggest Black nation in the world, and it sits on a lot of opportunity. So the success of Nigeria is key for Africa to actually be a viable business model for any even international company at all, right? So while that is the case, right, I think that one of my big best yesterday where we now have a license, right, for the industry. So I think the SEC's announcement of the 7 licenses that were released is a key next step in terms of a regulatory milestone that I've always been looking forward to. So now we have a regulatory regime, right? Now the next thing I think, obviously, is something we are also pushing for with the parliament, the Senate, right, where we can now potentially have a crypto bill that would at least serve as just generally the laws guiding like the trading and involvement of the Nigerians in cryptocurrency. I think with those 2 key things, we would have solved a huge problem, in terms of clarity. Now, on the other hand, there's a national blockchain strategy, right? Which, obviously we just set up a steering committee, which was also signed by the minister. So this is the steering committee that will guide the implementation of the blockchain framework in Nigeria. So that is also something I'm really looking forward to. And I feel like in the next 5 years, Nigeria's blockchain and crypto scene would mature up to a point where, we can make up for the lost time, over the past 5 years.
Well, one final note, if you allow me. And you mentioned it's the biggest country, Black country in the world. Africa has 2 souls, basically. Nigeria on the west side and Kenya on the outside, 2 pretty friendly countries. how would you compare the approach to countries and down below to sub-Saharan parts? How do you reframe Nigeria's situation in a more global scenario that is evolving, by the way? Because if Zambia, for instance, move, I expect South Africa to do the same, Botswana to do the same. On the other side, Kenya is leading Uganda, is leading also Tanzania, is leading Ethiopia, all of the area. So how would you reframe locally? Briefly, I mean, I don't want to do my return in too much, but that's my curiosity.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, actually, Andrea. If you look at the continent of Africa, obviously for contexts, Africa, if you look at Africa, you can see it as there are 54 countries in Africa, right? And we have the northern part of Africa, we have the sub-Saharan Africa, which is mostly the western part of Africa, West Central. And then we have the southern part of Africa, which is where we have South Africa, Zambia, Angola, and a bunch of countries down south. And regulation, obviously, across these 54 countries are different. And they mostly lean towards whoever the biggest leader for that region is. Like, for instance, in Southern Africa, South Africa is the biggest market there. And obviously, regulations that happen in South Africa influence the rest of the South, right? And guess what? The most parts of Southern Africa are very pro-crypto, right? South Africa has the crypto license, the CAPS license, which was they issued about 70 licenses like 2 months ago, right? And they are very right now open for business with crypto companies, essentially, right? So South Africa has been very positive, and that's influenced like the regulations in Zambia, the regulations in Botswana, and a bunch of those countries down there. If you go to the north, right, like Egypt, Morocco, and a bunch of these other countries, they are still very tight when it comes to crypto. So most countries in Northern Africa are not very crypto friendly. A few of them are. However, there are active conversations in the north to, evolve regulation, right? But obviously, there's a lot of to financial stability that are being considered, because of those economies are very tightly controlled. For instance, in Ethiopia, right? So these are just key things. And then obviously in East Africa, where Kenya is kind of like the market leader, today there are obviously moves in Kenya to establish their own central bank digital currency, which I think has kind of like now become the playbook, really, where you try a central bank digital currency and then think of a crypto license issue. So I think in Kenya today, like you still can service crypto companies. I run a payments business there, but we can't onboard crypto clients because of the deregulation. So it's quite a thing to see as like the regulation evolves. However, there are countries even still within East Africa like Rwanda, like Tanzania, who are okay to service crypto businesses. So regulation across Africa differs. It takes a certain understanding of the local context to actually begin to even appreciate like how deep it goes. But I do think that across board, if you look at where Africa was 5 years ago, and you look at where it is now, and you look at probably where it will be in the next 5 years, I think it's gonna keep getting better, right? So regulation is tilting towards Africa is tilting towards a regulated and safe space for crypto to thrive, basically, right? And obviously we are very early for the party, and yeah, so that's just pretty much I think my feedback on that question.
Nice fun. I'm done with questions. I would love to give back the mic to our guest. Any stage is yours again.
Yeah, I think for my side, it's been a very engaging conversation.
Nice one,
And
very nice one. I really enjoy this.
yeah, I'll just say that despite like the challenges generally, as I've mentioned a lot of challenges. Nigeria and Africa are still very, hopeful, right? So there is still a huge opportunity to take advantage of, and a huge opportunity on the continent to actually build around, right? So if you're interested in doing business in Africa, feel free, and yeah, hopefully we can connect another time.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for joining today. That is time. It did go over, but I am always very, very curious about what's going on in Nigeria. And Babs, for anyone who wants to dive deeper, Babs is reachable on LinkedIn. That's how I found you. That's how we connected. So look, there is so much opportunity over there. And thanks, Andrea, for moderating this session today.
You're welcome.
It's the last session of the day, and we are at the end of the Global Digital Asset Regulatory Summit. Thanks all of our speakers for being part of this summit, for all the attendees, both in the rooms and in the lobby, which we've learned something a little bit today, the DECA team, about how Zoom events work, but it seems to have gone relatively smoothly, actually. We have dived into so many different topics, some that I didn't quite expect. The relationships with our regulators really stood out for me, and how important that they are, actually more than a lot of other topics that came up today. Those relationships, the industry are really globally quite dependent on those fruitful and positive relationships and conversations that continue to happen. So we did talk about how digital assets are shaping various economies and how people are innovating to stay compliant. So today's discussions really did underscore to me also that the world is feeling the same frustrations, and the speed in which we innovate is often a lot quicker than our regulators all over the world. So it was interesting for me to hear about how different yet the same a lot of the industries internationally are feeling. So as we wrap up, yeah, it's pretty clear that the road is pretty rocky, but also we're just about to get over that hump globally. So thank you to all of our speakers who have joined us from all over the world, for your time, for your expertise, for your insights, and most importantly, your ongoing commitment to this industry, which is a pretty tough industry to build in and to operate in. So on that, safe travels, everyone. Thank you for tuning in, and we will see you at the next Digital Economy Council of Australia event. Have a good night and morning.